Hi, this is Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute, and welcome to VantagePoint. Very happy to have with us today Dr. Shanta Devarajan, the chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. And Shanta has been with the bank since 1991 and been working on many different aspects, including a lot of work on the social side of economic development, and was the director of the World Development Report in 2004, making services work for poor people. Prior to that, he was at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's an author of over 100, author and co-author of over 100 publications, and a good friend, and great to have you, Shanta.
Thanks for having me.
The Middle East and North Africa is a varied region, from very rich countries to very poor regions, and is a part of the world that's obviously gone through very dramatic change since 2011. How would you sort of describe the economic shape of developments since the turbulence of 2011? How has that impacted the economies as you see them?
Well, maybe we could take a step back and look at what the region looked like for the decade before 2011, because despite the fact that it's a very diverse region, the economic performance across the board was quite similar. First, they had very rapid growth. 5, 6, 7% for countries like Egypt and Tunisia and so on. Thanks to this growth, there was rapid poverty reduction. And this is not terribly well known, but inequality levels were actually quite low and declining in many of these countries. And yet we had revolutions in 4 countries and
now a lot of people link that to the shocks that happened, you know, in the global economy, the 2008 financial crisis, food prices, because you're describing an overall picture that seems positive.
That's right.
Was it the shocks that brought down the system, or something more systemic?
Yeah, I think it was something more systemic. They've had shocks before, and have had some shocks since then too, which we'll get to. No, I think what was really going on, and this comes out when you look at some of the happiness surveys, you know, the Gallup poll that asked people, because while all of these indicators were progressing positively, the happiness level was declining in these countries.
And was that perhaps, as a lot of people indicate, they bring in the communication revolution and technology? Is it because people began to see what was the case in advanced economies and they began to compare?
They may have some of that, but it connected to that. I think what was really going on was that the middle class was squeezed during this period. So what you had,
they were not progressing.
That's
too
right.
much.
The middle class was not progressing, and in fact were declining, whereas the very rich and the poor were improving their situation. And this might explain the paradox that inequality was going down while there was all this resentment and anxiety, is because the middle class were actually becoming more like the poor. And so that's why inequality was going down. But certainly when you've worked hard and entered the middle class,
separate yourself out, as it were.
Right, and you had expectations of a job and good public services, and all of those expectations were being defeated. And that's, I think, where the whole system broke. If you like, and another way I think about it is that there was an old social contract, which is actually surprisingly similar across the board, where the state provided jobs. The public sector was the main employer of university graduates. Also provided subsidized health education, and also subsidized food and fuel. And in return, the citizens, because they didn't want to threaten the largesse of the state, kept their voices quiet. And that was a contract that sustained
and you're
itself.
saying it ended up not working too well for the middle class in this period.
That's right, because the jobs weren't there.
The government could no longer
The public sector could no longer hire
Yeah.
jobs because they were running huge deficits, and the private sector didn't grow fast enough to absorb all the young people entering the labor force, these middle-class graduates, university graduates, to the point where the unemployment rate was the highest in the developing world in the Middle East and North Africa.
Okay, now that was 7 years ago.
That's right.
Is that now, in a way, something that's gone, ancient history? What has happened in the 6 years, you know, like with most, you know, instability, things go backwards before they go forwards. What's gotten worse, and has anything gotten better?
No, things have gotten worse across the board since 2011. There's no question. The Arab Spring countries, if you like, went into several years of turmoil, and some are still facing that, including places like Libya and Syria and Yemen that are in all full-blown civil war. But even Egypt and Tunisia, for instance, while they had a revolution and new government, and some of them had several new governments, are faced with things like terrorist attacks, which have certainly dampened tourism, which is a major source of revenue for Tunisia, and also have dampened foreign investment. So you've seen overall growth fall from an average of about 5%
so
to
how
about
is
2%.
that in the countries that have been impacted? Because maybe the UAE and Saudi Arabia are in a different situation. Obviously, they've, as you've said, all been impacted negatively because of instability and insecurity. Has it created some structural changes? Does it create conditions that might be, you can build on something?
Right. Well, actually, you mentioned UAE and Saudi Arabia because the other feature that has then made the rest of the region also being experiencing low growth is the fall in oil prices. So you had oil prices fall by about 50% starting in 2014. And that has meant that these other countries like Saudi Arabia, the GCC essentially, which were growing at a fairly rapid clip, now they are experiencing 1%
and their growth was helping to some degree the growth of others
through
remittances
and aid and capital flows.
And that's gone down as well.
So you've got, it's paradoxical because normally when price of oil goes down,
should be a good thing.
Good thing for the oil importers,
Yeah.
the Moroccos, the Tunisians. But these are the ones that rely on remittances and aid from Gulf countries, as well as I mentioned earlier, the terrorist attacks seem to have been in the oil importing countries like Egypt and Tunisia. So you've got the oil exporters not growing, the oil importers not growing, and of course the global economy is no great shape.
So let's stay there. Here we are at the beginning of 2017, low oil prices, not only slow global growth, but with the election of Donald Trump in the US and maybe other developments in Europe, but particularly in the US, threats maybe to the global trading regime that might have impact as well. I don't want to get too much into speculation about what the Trump presidency could mean for the global economy, but as you see the beginning of 2017 today in the MENA countries, in the Middle East and North Africa countries, what stands out? What are the prospects? Egypt is expecting moderate growth of 4 to 5%. Is that realistic? Are they on the right track? And we'll get back to Egypt in some more detail. But how do you see the bigger picture in 2017?
Okay, so what I see is that actually what's impressive, the good news, I think, is that in the middle of all of this, or maybe because of all of this, the countries have undertaken some pretty major structural reforms. For instance, energy subsidies. They've cut energy subsidies across the board in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Kuwait, and in Morocco, and Jordan, Tunisia not so much, and in Egypt most prominently. And that augurs well, because that leaves the economy in a better position to benefit from global growth, from trade, from investment in much better way than they would otherwise. So while growth, I think our projections for growth for 2017 are not very high, there are these what I might describe as green shoots in the area. And you mentioned Egypt. I mean, Egypt had a serious macroeconomic problem over the last 18 months, which was thankfully resolved in the late last year with the devaluation and then floating of the Egyptian pound, the introduction of the value-added tax, and a whole and some energy subsidy reforms, and that has rendered the economy in much better shape than it was. Before, and we're already seeing remittances
more
remittances.
I saw that. Hopes for more direct investment.
Exactly.
So
I mean, now so that's good news. The point is that what that is really representing is the fact that the economy was very distorted, and now it's getting the benefits of having solved that. That's not necessarily something that can sustain growth for a long time. It's like a one-shot improvement.
A dividend kind of. When
For sustaining growth, they still need to do a lot more structural reforms. I mean, the Egyptian business climate is still very, very sclerotic.
And is it because of red tape and the difficulty of doing business? That's one. Or are there still pricing issues?
Well, they're related. The pricing issues have to do with oligopolies which is connected to political elites and crony capitalism. So the Egyptian industrial sector is still not very dynamic. And in particular, there's very little growth in small and medium enterprises, which are the ones that are going to create the jobs.
And is that because of sort of local monopolies?
That's right. So you have monopolies
giants,
that are usually connected to the political elites that are able to sustain very high prices. And we see it's the same thing in Tunisia. Now
well, in Egypt, you also have sort of the military industrial or the military business side of things.
That's right.
They don't pay taxes. They don't, they have much better conditions, and that crowds out even the Egyptian private sector.
That's what they say. Yeah. Exactly. The Egyptian private sector is sometimes competing. But the main issue is the small and medium enterprises. We need to come up with ways in which they can grow and flourish, and really be. Egypt could be a major manufacturing exporter. It's well placed. It's got a
great workforce,
great location, and
ports and canals,
and a reasonably educated population. But we need to break this. We need to bring domestic competition, real, genuine domestic competition in the economy.
Well, you talked earlier about the old social contract. And now with the lifting of subsidies, with the floating of, and I'm not just talking about Egypt, but the state is no longer able to be the welfare state or the national socialist state in an economic sense that it was. And yet, the political arenas have been closed off as well. Do you see a new social contract taking place, or simply the absence of a contract?
No, I think there is a new social contract, because it's not the case that the state is completely withdrawing from the economy. On the contrary, I think we need a system where the state promotes the private economy rather than captures it. And that's what's happening. I mean, take the energy...
That it enables the private sector and takes care of the most vulnerable rather than everybody.
And you think about energy subsidies, which is a reflection of this. When you have energy subsidies, and when you're spending 6, 7, 10% of GDP on fuel subsidies,
energy,
right? What that means is what it tells the poor person: if you want to get a benefit from the state, you have to consume fuel, right? And as a result, of course, the rich are the ones who get the biggest benefit, because they drive the gas-guzzling cars. If you convert that to a cash transfer, then the individual says, you tell the individual, you can spend it on whatever you like.
They prioritize.
They prioritize, rather than the state prioritizes for you. So that's the shift in the social contract.
Have a number of countries gone with cash transfer?
That's right.
I know Iran did it a while ago.
Egypt has done it. I mean, it's scaling it up, but now it covers, 10 million people.
Tunisia,
Morocco. They all have pieces of it, Morocco and Tunisia. But interestingly, the Gulf states are now going. Saudi Arabia just introduced a cash transfer program. Kuwait is considering it. So all of these countries are beginning to move in that direction. And I think those are the ingredients of a new social contract. We're not there yet.
Not there yet.
But
let me ask you something about economic integration. A lot of the economies in the region were rentier states selling raw material, or they were rather closed off, crony capitalists at a certain point, import substitution and so on. And now we're in a world where, if you want to really get ahead through exports, you have to be competitive and open up. To what degree do you see regional economic integration as essential? Or can countries in the region just go, from country to global? Or do we have to pass through the hard work of regional infrastructure, regional integration, so that we really have the synergies of a region?
Now, the MENA is the least integrated region in the world. But on the other hand, it's understandable, because they produce more or less the same products. So there's not much gain to be had by trading with each other, which is why they don't have much trade with each other. The big ticket item is going to be trade with the rest of the world. Now, there are some cases where regional integration can facilitate that. Say, take the Maghreb, for instance, trading with Europe. Right? There'll be huge gains from opening up trade with Europe. No question about that. But you could think of it where there's a value chain within the Maghreb, between Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, where products are made along the chain,
integrated way,
way, and then sold to Europe.
Yeah.
So in that sense, regional integration can have a huge benefit if it is accompanied by this opening up of trade.
Yeah, if there's like a clear target, as it were, that
Right.
it's benefiting a
Exactly.
global market that you can
Now,
identify.
the only other thing I would add is that trade integration may not by itself generate big benefits, but infrastructure integration could have huge benefits too. You could
Yeah,
have
that's what I was
you
partly
could have a
talking
regional
about. Yeah.
electricity
Energy
market.
integration,
Yeah, exactly.
electricity.
Water.
Yeah.
So those could have huge benefits. And let me add that, and this is one of the thinking that this is our thinking at the moment, which is that all of these things, including trade integration, help build some kind of trust among the countries. And that, because it's not a secret that some of these countries are engaged in proxy wars with each
Yeah, I've
other.
noticed that. I've noticed that, yeah.
So it could be that trade integration would be a way of trying to build trust and then bring down some of the hostility around our
Definitely.
proxy
Might it
wars.
also encourage some foreign direct investment? Because if they can invest in a regional market and regional capacities rather than country by country,
You diversify.
you get a bit more of that.
Right.
Let me ask you a bit on the status of women in MENA economies. What's the general picture, and what are the trends? Are they doing better? Are they being squeezed out? And then I want to ask about, obviously, the big cohort of youth. But let's start with
the women. I mean, there's, again, good news and bad news. The good news is women are being educated at unprecedented rates, right? The percentage of women, there are more women than men in primary school, secondary school, and
Really, at
tertiary.
all levels?
Yeah, at all
I thought it
levels.
was at university only.
Yeah,
all levels.
at all levels, the enrollment rates are higher. So basically, the women in
That's
the Arab
working,
world are more
education-wise.
educated than the bad news is the labor force participation rate is the lowest in the world.
In the world.
It's like 23%. And of course, the unemployment rate for those in the labor force is also very high.
very
It's
high,
like double
yeah.
the average unemployment rate. So this is very disturbing because these women are extremely well educated and then are not in the labor force. And that's a huge loss. I mean, you can think of how much more these countries can do.
Have any countries done particularly well, and is it a cultural thing? Is it a regulation issue? Is it a skill? It's not a skills issue.
I think it goes back to the labor market.
Yeah.
See, basically, the women were disproportionately hired in the public sector because that was a safe environment and it had predictable hours and conditions. Then when the public sector stopped hiring,
so that
see, a lot of the
side
men,
effect partly,
right,
yeah.
the men started working in the informal sector. But the informal sector is not very hospitable to women. It's insecure and they can get harassed without any retribution.
There's no structured environment.
Exactly. And so they dropped out of the labor force.
Interesting.
So I actually don't buy, I mean, I'm sure there are cultural factors involved, but the studies that I have seen show that this is a pure market phenomenon that is standing in the way. So again, we come back to if we can build the formal private sector, then you might see more women.
That empowers women more. And that's
entering.
one of the
Exactly.
positive elements.
And there's no question, if you want to grow a middle class, you have to have a middle class where there are two adults working in the family, and that's the way all successful countries have done it. And I think we should be going in that direction.
On youth, obviously an enormous cohort. What's the picture, first of all, and obviously the prospect. It's always repeated that you need 10 million jobs over the next so many years, and they're not going to happen, those jobs. What's the current situation? What are the prospects as far as you see?
Well, I think, again, the youth unemployment rate is double the average unemployment rate, and this is perhaps the number one priority in the region.
Absolutely.
Because it's more than just the fact that these young people, and by the way, the university educated ones have an even higher unemployment rate than the less well educated ones. And it's more than the fact that when you're unemployed, you don't have a job. it's also a sense of exclusion. See, if you're unemployed in Egypt, or you're young male unemployed, you live with your family, you can't marry, and
you're frustrated,
you begin
you're
to get
disempowered.
and you begin to get excluded from society. And we've done some work that actually shows that it's associated with the propensity to go and join terrorist groups like Daesh. So the youth unemployment problem has huge externalities all over the country. So this has to be our number one priority. Now,
when you say, for example, let me link one thing to the other. When you say one might expect growth of 4% in Egyptian economy, but how much is that correlated with job growth?
Yeah, no, it's
because those could go in different
That's
directions.
right, and we've had that, right? I mean,
And that happened
as I said,
before the
they had
uprisings.
7% growth and very little job growth. So no, I think the focus has to be on job creating growth.
And is that because of different sectors or formal
Exactly.
and informal?
It's
How would you summarize?
It's the rentier sector versus the productive sector. So you've got in Egypt the big real estate and the
Suez
extractives
Canal
industries
and whatnot,
and so on were the big sources of growth. But what you really need is the chemicals, the manufacturing, the plastics, and the electronics sector. That can create jobs, and that is the big challenge. But as I said, we also know what it's going to take to get that growth, which is creating domestic competition,
the conditions, and then let it grow sort of organically.
Exactly.
Well, when you talk about sectors, and you've talked a lot about the manufacturing and export and so on. Yet we see countries, for example, like India and so on, which have taken off, or some parts of the Indian economy has taken off, sort of on the high tech or services, or software and that kind of, and then it's created a great boom in some parts of India, for example. And there's some dynamism in Egypt and Jordan, UAE and Beirut and so on the new technology,
the services,
the information revolution. In your sort of surveys and studies, to what degree is that sector a real, a heavyweight that could make an impact?
It's significant, particularly as you said in Jordan, places like that. But it's not going to be the big employer. And by the way, it's not the big employer in India either. I mean, India has a labor force of 400 million, and the entire IT enabling services sector hires about 4 million. So it's 1%,
and that's that's an exceptional example.
That's the boom.
That's the biggest one,
right. So, but I would say that the service sector in general could be an engine of growth, of job creating growth. But that's really like tourism, hospitality, all of those also could be engines of growth. But for that you need both the investment climate, but also peace and some level of stability.
Well, as we're ending, because time is coming a little bit to a close, I want to ask a little bit about how you do see the new U.S. administration's potential economic policies and impacts, and then I want to ask you a bit about the bank and what it does in the Middle East. So, at the bank, you're looking at these developments. You have to, plan ahead.
As you know, there's I think the one constant is that there's huge uncertainty.
Yes.
The level of uncertainty has gone up
Yes.
Around what the administration will do, the new U.S. administration. And I would say there are two, again, countervailing factors. I mean, if the administration goes ahead with its plan for a stimulus, which is a tax cut and an increase in infrastructure, that's going to have a boosting effect on the U.S. economy,
Which
and
can then have a boosting effect
on the global economy. So that's the positive side.
Okay.
But if they also impose tariffs or other kinds of restrictions on trade,
And get a trade
again,
war of
that
some
may
kind,
not. It's only if it turns into a trade war could that be a real disaster for MENA. If by itself it might have some effect, but not.
But if it becomes like a global pattern,
then it could be
which
very
will lead
serious.
to, I would imagine, a global downturn.
That'd be a very serious global downturn. Yeah.
Serious. So you hope for one and not the other, I guess. So in ending, what do you guys do in the Middle East today? World Bank, how do you see your mission? What impact do you have?
Well, we have about a year and a half ago decided that we were going to dedicate our mission in the Middle East and North Africa towards promoting peace and stability in the region through economic and social inclusion. So it's not the usual World Bank style of
build a dam
and
pave a
also
road
exactly
yeah.
building infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure when you've got a civil war going on is not necessarily the best way to proceed. And we've had cases where we built a road and then there's been a bomb and the road has disappeared. So we are trying to strengthen institutions to create social and economic inclusion. So for instance, we have a project focusing on Upper Egypt, so southern Egypt, trying to create jobs and build infrastructure for for communities in Upper Egypt. And this is having that sense of empowerment, because what we realize is that...
And that's done through projects with the government?
Yeah, with the government. The central government, borrows the
okay.
money, but then the money actually ends up in the governorates, in the three governorates in
and
southern
what kind
Egypt.
of things are being in Upper Egypt, for example?
Yeah, so there's some infrastructure, mainly maintenance of roads and
to
other
create a
kinds of
local
infrastructure.
economy. In
Yes,
effect.
and enable people to go to work where it would be easy.
Yeah.
Then there's entrepreneurship, especially focused on women, some self-help businesses and things like that. And then some agriculture development as well.
Fantastic. Are you able to do anything in the conflict countries today?
Yeah, so
Libya,
yes.
Syria, Yemen?
Well, perhaps the most interesting one is we just recently started disbursing 2 loans to Yemen. They're actually grants, which were already approved before the war started. But our usual rules are, when there's a de facto government, we stop dispersing. But this war has been going on now for almost 2 years. And so what we decided was that there is a way to disperse these loans without necessarily having a government, if there was a third party that could actually make sure that the money was spent for the purposes to which it was intended. So we have one loan which is for immunizing children.
Absolutely.
And that's very necessary because it avoids long-term damage. And that's being dispersed through WHO. And another one which provides cash grants is the Social Fund for Development, which is a very well-run organization, but that's being dispersed through UNDP. So we are working in the conflict area. In Iraq as well, we have a project in Iraq that helps to rebuild infrastructure in those areas that Daesh has just vacated.
Yeah.
And this both, because Daesh, when they leave, tend to destroy the infrastructure.
They don't leave much behind.
But also it helps to build trust with the communities and the government.
So they come back and they live.
That's
and,
right.
they have some
So
security.
that's a loan in Iraq. So we're trying every which way to do as much as we can.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you, Shanta. This has been very, very fascinating and very, very interesting. And thank you for being with us today. We've been with Dr. Devarajan, head of chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. And thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.